Shannon, I'll start with you, because as we were hearing, I guess one way to put it, the niceties, the camaraderie being shared across that table. Danielle Smith, the Premier of Alberta, sent out a message on social media, and she basically said that the federal government continues to publicly and privately float the idea of cutting off energy supply to the U.S. and imposing export tariffs on Alberta energy and other products to the United States. Until these threats cease, Alberta will not be able to fully support the federal government's plan in dealing with the threatened tariffs. So again, that's from Danielle Smith, the Alberta Premier. Very marked difference, or at least contrast to what we heard here in Ottawa. What do you make of that disconnect?
Well, what was interesting juxtaposed with that is we also heard one of the Prime Minister's early remarks was about how one area of the country shouldn't pay the price for all of this, which seemed like sort of a gesture towards her before we saw this statement. So it seems like he's making an effort to acknowledge those concerns. It's really hard to tell. Like, I have sympathy for the fact that this is a major, major part of her province's economy, that they would be hurt in bigger ways than anyone else, but also that it is the biggest carrot or stick Canada has on the whole to sort of shake at the U.S. So to withhold it, to say it's off the table, takes away a really large bargaining chip. And just the way she's communicating all this comes across as very obstructionist. Like she has just, through her whole tenure as Premier, her whole thing has been flipping the bird across the country towards Ottawa, right? And so there is like a very specific thing going on here that I understand why she would be concerned on behalf of her province, but there's also a larger behavior pattern, I would say.
Mm-hmm. Well, what do you make of the disconnect, Chris?
It suggests to me that, and especially from what we heard also at the table here in Ottawa, it suggests to me that it's kind of a 12v1 in this particular case, and it's somewhat ironic that she's not even in Canada and can't sit at the table and speak for herself, right? She had to do it on social media press release. And it was also stark to notice two things. Premier Ford of Ontario come out and say, I'm sorry, but united we stand, divided we fall. And him basically saying, I'm sorry, but yes, I'm Premier of Ontario, and I still care more about the broader interests of Canada. He was quite frankly sounding more prime ministerial than he was premier-like at this point. And I wonder if around the table that function has kind of de facto fallen to him, since we have essentially an outgoing prime minister. But then to have the Prime Minister Trudeau say, it's important to remember that the #1 target of the Trump administration is the auto sector in Ontario, is, I think, the Prime Minister's way of saying, I'm sorry, Danielle Smith, I know you're worried about oil, I know you're worried about energy, but Ontario has a huge problem with the incoming administration that is going to be a pain in its behind, and it could cost it, I think, up to 500,000 jobs. Might not have been referring to just auto, but tremendous amount of Ontario's manufacturing power comes from the auto industry, and he's saying, you're worried about your energy. Trump has specifically targeted Ontario's auto manufacturing, and yet Doug Ford is still saying, sorry, it's Canada first, not just Ontario. So you do get the sense there's a subtle attempt here to paint Danielle Smith into a corner as being maybe thinking selfishly compared to the broader needs of the country, and isolate her and kind of force her into the team kind of vibe, if I could say it that way.
Mm-hmm. What do you make of the disconnect?
Well, we often pair Danielle Smith and Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe together as two constant thorns in Ottawa's side. And Moe absolutely acknowledged that in the press conference, made a bit of a joke out of it, which revealed the humor that you sometimes get from these premiers when they spend some time together. Bob Canoe also showed some of that. But Premier Moe very quickly pivoted to this sort of, broadly agreeable language, with productive conversation kind of language. And so to Chris's point, it suggests that the people who were in the room felt one way, and for reasons that we're reading about on social media, the Alberta Premier felt a different way.
Yeah, it does perhaps suggest that there is a feeling or a hope that when the tariffs actually come through, if and when they come through, that there will be a carve-out for Alberta energy, for oil and gas, because the United States, quite frankly, needs Canadian oil and gas. It is 50% of what of their gas supply, so they are very reliant on Alberta, and perhaps that's pegging to it. But I think it brings back the other question I had earlier today. Danielle Smith, say what you will, she's standing up, in her opinion, for Albertans, for the largest contributor to the Alberta economy in terms of job, in terms of wealth creation. She wants to stand up for that, but that does again bring up the issue of how disunifying this type of talk is going to be, which might explain why Scott Moe wanted to lean in on the carrot rather than the stick at this moment in time. The short game being convince Americans of how important Canada is, and then we can talk about the thornier issues down the road. What do you make of that kind of analysis of it?
Well, what's interesting is Danielle Smith said in an interview I read just in the last day or two that she didn't expect carve-outs. Whether she actually meant that or that was some kind of public negotiating tactic, I don't know. But from the beginning, she has been very go-it-alone about this. Remember when these threats first came out from Trump, and he was at the time basing it on supposed lack of border security, problems with fentanyl, illegal migrants. Right away, she was like, yeah, you're right, we do have a problem, and we need to beef it up. So immediately, she hived herself off and sided with the incoming U.S. administration. So to me, this is in keeping. Like, it seems like her tactic is to cozy up through her own channels. We saw her get invited to Mar-a-Lago by Kevin O'Leary. She seems to be sort of taking her own back channels, but that would seem to run counter to the idea that she's not expecting carve-outs. Like, if you're sort of working your own back channels, to me, you're looking for a deal for yourself to protect yourself and your people, but then she's publicly saying she doesn't expect it. So I find it really hard to parse this, to be honest.
Mm-hmm. You get a sense she's trying to placate.
Yeah.
That's her strategy, is placate the Trump administration. And I don't have a number of examples that I can, off the top of my head, that I can point to, but it doesn't feel like it was something that was particularly successful in the first Trump administration, because he does give you the impression, and he's written about this, in fact, in The Art of the Deal, he's someone who wants to bulldoze. He always wants to win. And someone who always wants to win is always going to be pulling the cover towards them, the very kind of greedy person in the bed that takes the duvet and then turns the aircon on, And so the strategy of trying to placate the Trump administration is surprising to me. But I can't say I'm also falling off my chair that a premier is going to work to defend the people who elect them. And that's provincial members, residents. That's Albertans. It's not Manitobans. It's not the Ontario auto sector. It's Albertans and oil and energy workers.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I'm wondering what else stood out for you for that news conference, though, because I think the word you used was bromide, because it didn't seem to be a lot of substantive things coming out of that meeting other than to say that we're going to be standing up for Canada. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, it's pretty common knowledge that communiques before events like this, whether they're national or international, are written in advance. They're poured over and then you have little tweaks. Often to the language to satisfy everybody in the room, or as many people as possible. The communique that came out of this feels like it was written before this meeting and wasn't touched at this meeting. We don't know what they talked about behind closed doors, but there's nothing really revolutionary in here. So what's on my mind right now is thinking about, on the topic of Danielle Smith going to Mar-a-Lago, all of these premiers, around the time that Chrystia Freeland resigned and shocked everybody, they agreed at that meeting, because they were meeting when that happened in Toronto, to leverage whatever contacts they had and to go meet as many people as they could. And I don't think anybody had on their bingo card in Canada that meant that a couple of days later that Yukon's premier would be with Donald Trump Jr. at a hunting lodge in North Carolina talking about why the 51st state is not going to happen and why tariffs are a bad idea. And so looking at this communique and listening to what they all just talked about, I'm thinking, well, maybe they're thinking about their itineraries now and what their next step is to accomplish whatever goals they individually want, so that whenever they come back to talk more, they have something else to offer, because this is not a lot of new here.
Yeah, no, not a lot of new. Although, I was surprised that more questions were not asked of the other premiers that were gathered there, and also no questions asked of Kirsten Hillman, Canada's ambassador to the United States, because in this moment in time she plays such a critical role. Although I wonder as to what more she might have added, because it seems right now the focus is on the diplomatic front, and perhaps that's a wait-and-see attitude, because again, the inauguration happens on Monday, and we'll know more then. Do you think there's anything to offer until that kind of decision is made from Washington? Because again, this is a threat, not
Exactly.
Not yet codified, not yet announced, but still just a threat.
Yeah, I do. You definitely heard it, I think, even from the mouth of the Prime Minister, that they don't want to announce anything concrete until they know what they're facing. And, why announce we're going to do tariffs when you don't know if Trump will, and then just by doing that you embolden him. I think there's a risk that they're calculating there. So ideally, and hopefully they have a list of scenarios. If Trump does this, then we do this, and of escalating levels and intensity. And I'm assuming that's what the government, the federal government particularly, is working on. I did see there was something in this communique. I do completely agree with Nick that there's not a ton, but they are talking very specifically now of redistributing any revenues from the retaliatory tariffs to things that are a little bit cut off in the paper here. But there's this idea of redistributing, so the government doesn't stand to necessarily try to benefit from these tariffs. It's an easy political solution. The government doesn't want to make money on this, but I'm curious to see what that looks like in their scenarios.